Hello, welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this week's video, I've got a brand new stencil design to show you from Dixie Belle Paint called Bone Inlay. As the name may suggest, you can create your own bone inlay type looks with it. It's such a good stencil. It's one of my favourites that Dixie Belle have ever produced. It's super versatile. You will be seeing a lot more of it in the future from me, I can guarantee that. And I am going to be keeping this cabinet because I absolutely love how it turned out. So I'm going to show you exactly how I use the stencil on this piece. I'm going to start off by saying how hard this piece was to film, because my obviously YouTube requires you to film landscape, and this cabinet is tall and narrow, not like my good self. So it was quite hard to try and film this all in one shot, so you might see just snippets of it. Anyway, let's get on to the cabinet itself and what I did. I'm going to prep this in a slightly different way because this is shisham wood, which is notoriously oily, and it also has a tendency to bleed, and I'm going to be using a pale colour on this. So I'm cleaning it as usual all over with Dixie Belle's White Lightning, and then I gave it a rinse. Also, it's worth noting that there was no compromise finish on this piece whatsoever. The varnish was in good condition. Sometimes these pieces are waxed, sometimes they're varnished. This one was varnished, so that's why I was able to do the prep that I was able to do. If it was waxed, you would need to strip that before you started painting. But it's varnished and it is in really good condition. There's no chips or cracking to that varnish at all. So I went straight in with Dixie Belle's White Lightning, which is a degreasing and deglossing cleaner. Cleaned it all over top to bottom, and then I didn't sand. No sanding. I'm not going to break that existing seal on that varnish. So Dixie Belle have just come out with a brand new primer, which is basically an adhesion primer and a stain blocking primer in one. So previously to this primer, there was always two different primers for very specific jobs. One was to help you get your paint to grip onto shiny glossy surfaces, and the other one was to stop bleed through happening. They've actually made one primer that does both of those jobs together, so this project is perfect for using this primer on. So I'm not going to sand because the primer is going to grip onto that shiny surface really well, so I don't need to sand, and also it's going to help block any stains that are potentially going to come through from that warm toned wood, which shouldn't happen because I haven't sanded and broke that original finish, but it's always good just to have a backup in case, especially with wood like this. This primer comes in three colours. You can get it in white, grey and clear. I'm using the grey on this one because my cabinet is actually going to be painted yellow. And I'm going to be using one of the brand new Silk Mineral Paint colours called Yellowstone. So basically this grey is going to help go in between that kind of reddy, orangey toned wood to lift it a little bit and help me get that coverage I need with the yellow. If you are used to using Slick Stick or Boss, this is a very similar application, and the drying time and everything like that is exactly the same as well. So Dixie Belle recommend 2 to 3 coats of this primer, and then make sure your final coat is left for 24 hours before you start applying your paint. It might seem a long time to wait because you want to get just stuck in with your paint, but trust me, it is worth leaving because that's when it's doing its job. The drying time is when it's doing its job. It's adhering to the surface and it's blocking those stains. So make sure you leave it 24 hours before you even start painting. Fast forward 24 hours and I'm ready to apply my paint. So I'm using the colour Yellowstone from the Silk Mineral Paint range. I will list all the products that I've used in the description below, as I always do. I'm using it with a synthetic brush because I'm just going for a one colour finish, because this is going to be heavily stenciled. If you caught a glimpse of this in the intro, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So I'm going to let the stencil do the talking on this. So I'm not going to distress it. I'm not going to add any coloured waxes. I am just painting this in a one colour finish. Silk Mineral Paint does have a built-in top coat, and it also has a built-in stain blocking primer. However, you can still use Bond Emboss with this paint. Bond Emboss is compatible with all 3 paint ranges from Dixie Belle. So even though, like I say, it does have that built-in stain blocking primer, I'm still using Bond Emboss on this particular piece because it was quite shiny and glossy, and I wanted the Bond Emboss for grip as well as to block any stains. So notoriously yellows can be a little bit iffy coverage wise, but as you can see, this is going over the grey primer perfectly, and this is what I mean about the primer helping you get that coverage. I recently painted a plant stand in the same colour, and it did take 3 coats because the plant stand was originally black, so it's taking obviously an extra coat to get that coverage, whereas if you've already used a grey primer, it's just going to help you, and this cabinet only took 2 coats. The stencil that I'm going to use is called Bone Inlay, and it's a brand new stencil from Dixie Belle Paint, which is due to be with Dixie Belle retailers in March 2024. It comes in a large sheet like this, and I'm going to cut it up. So I'm using a ruler and a craft knife so I get a nice straight edge, and it's just going to give me a little bit of versatility cutting it up like this. You don't have to, you can keep it in one big sheet if you wanted to, but I just know I'm going to get the most amount of use out of this if I cut all of the individual elements up. So as you can see, I've got lots and lots of different pieces, which is going to help me create my own design on this cabinet. So I've got my stencil chopped up into all those individual little pieces, which is going to make it easier to apply on this piece. And I'm going to show you how you can change any paintbrush into a stencil brush. So usually stencil brushes have got quite short bristles and stiff as well. That gives you that, obviously, that control when you're pouncing the paint on the stencil. These brushes are okay, but they're quite long. So this is a Dixie Belle synthetic small round small, and the bristles are really long. These are really good, by the way, for painting things like spindles. Perfect. Anyway, stencil bristles tend to be a lot shorter, so what you don't want to do is have your paintbrush kind of flopping all over the place. You want control and precision where you're applying your paint onto your stencil. So all you need is some painter's tape and your ideally round brush. You can do it with oval, you can also do it with flat, but I prefer a round brush. It just gives you a better surface area to apply the paint on to the stencil. And then just take a little bit of the painter's tape and wrap it around the bristle. You want to leave, obviously, enough to get the paint on. You don't want to take it right down to the end. That is absolutely fine, and what that does is obviously it's going to compact the bristles, stop them splaying out everywhere, and give you that kind of precision when you're applying your paint onto your stencil. Another tip that I'm going to give you for stenciling is consistency of paint. So there's lots of different paints out there, and they're all different consistencies. Some are thin, some are thick, and the thicker your paint, the easier it is to stencil, because you want as little amount of paint as possible on the stencil. Otherwise you get like a bleed through, which is where the paint seeps underneath your stencil and you don't get a crisp line. So this paint that I'm using is Dixie Belle's chalk mineral paint in the colour Cotton. Now I don't use whites an awful lot, so this actually is a fairly decent consistency because it's had the lid screwed on, and it hasn't been used and dried up like some of my other colours have. If you've seen some of my other videos, you know what I'm talking about. So this is actually a fairly decent consistency. I'd say it's probably a touch thicker than what it is if it's brand new paint. So obviously that's going to work to my advantage. But if you are using a thinner paint, I'm thinking silk mineral paint, for example, which is a thinner paint than chalk mineral paint. What you can do is add a little bit of sea spray into that paint, not a lot. We don't want texture. Textured stenciling I can cover on a separate video, but that's not for today. But a little bit of sea spray into your paint. It works with terra, it works with silk, and it works with chalk mineral paint. Mix it up so it's a really even consistency. That will help thicken the paint, and that will give you less seepage underneath your stencil. I wasn't going to add any sea spray to my paint, but I did for the video purposes, just to show you how little sea spray you actually need. It's literally just a sprinkle, even though my camera decided not to focus on what I was doing, which was really helpful. But this close-up is kind of the consistency that you're looking for. And then what you need to do is load your paintbrush up with the paint, or the paint mixture if you choose to put sea spray in, and then get a rag or some shop cloth and remove as much of the paint as possible. You also want to work with a dry brush. You don't want to introduce any water to the bristles or the surface that you're stenciling in, because that will obviously make the paint thinner, and that way you are likely to get kind of seepage and bleed through underneath your stencil. So obviously this stencil is cut up into small pieces, so I'm using painter's tape to kind of hold it in place, and then my left hand is holding the stencil flat to the surface. You want as little gap as possible between the stencil and the surface that you're stenciling, because if there is a gap, again, you're not going to get any crisp lines. So you need to use both hands. Your painter's tape is going to act as like your third hand that just holds it in place should you need to move like this, you need to adjust it or anything, or you need to grab some more paint or a rag or whatever, and then you just need to make sure you press it back down flat on the surface. This is a tricky surface because obviously it's kind of like a panelled area which is recessed from the rest of the cabinet. So depending on the surface, the type of furniture that you are stenciling, you might need to use more or less tape, you might need to hold it down flatter. Sometimes it feels like you need 8 hands to stencil, but just take your time, and I usually go from one side to the other or from top to bottom and just work in quite a methodical way. It can be quite a slow process because the last thing you want to do is try and load your brush up too much with paint and try and get it done quicker, but it won't work, it won't happen, you will get bleed through and you'll end up regretting it. Luckily this piece, well not luckily, because the stencil is super versatile and I will be painting more pieces and using this stencil to show you how many different ways you can use it, but it was almost like this stencil was made for this cabinet. The elements that fit so well within like the recesses. There's a couple of different trim pieces like the one that I'm using now that just fit perfectly onto the piece, and if you look at a bone inlay piece, they are generally absolutely crammed with pattern. So I did try and fit this stencil in every single last little bit that I could. Went around the corners and obviously did the sides as well. And I know what some of the questions are going to be in the comments and on social media. They're going to be, how did you know that those stencils would fit all the way around the piece and in all the different bits of the different cabinet? And the answer to that question in the footage, as you can see here, is I didn't. I winged it. I knew there'd be an element, at least one element, that would fit in every single surface of this piece. It was just figuring it out. Like that piece there definitely didn't work there, but it did fit at the bottom on its little dinky feet. That piece there was too big, too wide. That piece there was the piece that I went with for the kind of surrounds of the door panel. There's also some really clever little bits in here, which means you can make a continuous pattern or add bits on or take bits away depending on what you're stenciling. Like corner pieces, which will enable you to go around corners and trims. Like I say, it's such a versatile stencil. You will be seeing a lot of this in the future from me, and I will be able to show you all the different ways you can use it. So this is the long trim bit that I did around the kind of door panelled areas. And again, starting from the top and working my way down with my left hand pressing the stencil flat to the surface and using that tape as like a third hand just to hold it in place while I kind of move my paintbrush around and add more paint onto my paintbrush. And also trying to work in like quite a methodical way so that I get a nice continuous pattern and I don't go over the paint that's wet. That's another thing. If you do go over obviously the wet paint, it might cause it to smudge, so I kind of moved the stencil around until the other bit was touch dry and then went back to that bit and then continued the pattern down. It was a long process. There's a few hours worth of stenciling here, and I went round the door trims in white as well just because I thought that looked best, and then I gave it a little bit of a white trim at the top, and then I also repeated that at the bottom as well. So this is another part of the stencil. This is actually different to the kind of scroll pattern on the front. This is slightly larger. Again, so many different elements to this. And this had kind of like a circular design in the centre, as you can see there. But there's also a separate circle that I cut out that enabled me to kind of continue that pattern. Because again, bone inlay, they generally make use of all of the space of the furniture. If you look at a bone inlay piece, they are just covered from top to bottom. So I wanted to just not make sure that that piece was kind of floating in the centre. So I used the separate circle just to make sure that all of the space was filled, and that made it like a continuous pattern. Once the cabinet was stenciled within an inch of its life and everything was dry, I did seal the final thing with easy peasy spray wax because it's the easiest and quickest way to seal, and obviously I used chalk mineral paint for the stenciling. So here's a couple of close-ups as I always show you, and the finished piece. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure if you don't subscribe to my channel, you click the subscribe button for more videos like this one, and I will catch you next time. Bye!